I have spent most of my adult life being described as reliable, dependable, the one you can always count on. People said this about me as if it were a compliment, and I received it as one, and I spent years not understanding why being reliable was making me so deeply, quietly miserable. The answer was that I wasn't reliable. I was afraid. I was afraid to say no. I was afraid of what would happen to the way people perceived me if I declined a request or declined to show up or said, honestly and clearly, I don't have the capacity for this right now. I had built an identity so thoroughly around availability that the idea of becoming unavailable felt like a kind of death, the death of something I needed people to see when they looked at me. This story is about a specific moment when that pattern had a cost I couldn't ignore anymore. But I want you to understand that this moment didn't appear from nowhere. It was the accumulation of years. My colleague's name was Priya. We'd worked together for 2 years at a mid-sized nonprofit, and I liked her. She was smart and creative and operated with a kind of breezy confidence that I envied, partly because it was so different from my own way of moving through the world. Priya was the kind of person who asked for what she needed without apology. I was the opposite, the kind of person who gave what was asked before the ask was even finished. The project was a large grant report due in 6 weeks. Our director had asked both of us to work on it, but it quickly became clear that the actual work was going to fall unevenly. Priya had a personal event happening, a wedding she was planning, and she mentioned it casually and repeatedly as context. Not as an excuse, just as ambient information. And I, without being asked, began absorbing her portions. Not because anyone forced me. Not because there was any explicit request. I just started doing it. I stayed late. I took on her sections. When she'd check in on progress, I'd have things ready and I'd say it was no problem. It was a problem. It was enormously, unsustainably a problem. By week 3 I was working 12-hour days and going home exhausted in a way that wasn't just physical. I was depleted in the specific way that comes from giving more than you have while telling yourself and everyone else that you're fine. The word that lives in my chest from that period is resentment. I resented the situation. I resented Priya, even though she hadn't asked me to do anything I hadn't voluntarily stepped in to do. I resented my own inability to say a single 2-letter word. My director noticed. She called me into her office and asked how I was doing, and I sat across from her and said everything was going really well. I said I was on track. I smiled. She said, "Are you sure? Because you look tired." And I said, "I'm fine, really." I have replayed that moment so many times. Not because of what I said, I know why I said it. I said it because the alternative was admitting that I had volunteered myself into a situation I was drowning in, and that felt, at the time, like admitting a failure. As if the problem wasn't the imbalance of the workload but my inability to carry it. That's what people-pleasing does to your thinking. It reframes unsustainable demands as personal deficiencies. When you can't keep up with what you've agreed to, the problem, in your own mind, becomes your weakness, not the agreement itself. I finished the grant report. It was good work. Our organization received the funding. There were congratulations and a team lunch, and Priya thanked me warmly and sincerely. And 3 weeks after the project ended, I had what I can only describe as a slow-motion collapse. Not dramatic, no breakdown, no crisis event. Just a persistent, comprehensive exhaustion that arrived and didn't leave. I stopped being able to do things I normally did without thinking. Simple tasks felt effortful. I cried in my car twice for no identifiable reason. My doctor called it burnout. I took 2 weeks off work. In that time, I had space to be honest with myself in ways I'd been avoiding. Here's what I had to admit: I had done this before. Many times. The Priya situation wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. I could trace it through almost every significant relationship and professional situation in my life. Friend who needed me to show up even when I was depleted, I showed up. Family member who needed help I didn't have, I found it somehow. Colleagues who needed extra work absorbed. Every time, I had framed it as generosity, and it had been, at least in part. But underneath the generosity was something else, a deep, persistent terror that if I said no, I would be loved less. That terror has a history, and the history is personal enough that I won't lay all of it out here. But the short version is, I learned early that love was conditional on usefulness. That being needed was the surest way to be kept. And so I made myself endlessly, exhaustingly available, and called it a virtue, and never examined the transaction underneath. The work I've done since then, in therapy, and in the small daily practice of actually saying no when no is the honest answer, has been harder than the grant report. Harder than 12-hour days. Because it has required me to confront the belief that I am only as valuable as what I can provide. I am still working on this. I want to be honest about that. I still feel the pull toward yes when no would be correct. But I feel it now, and I name it, and that naming creates a moment between the impulse and the action in which I can make a different choice. The first time I said no to something I would normally have absorbed, I felt guilty for a week. But I also felt something else, a faint, quiet sense of being present in my own life in a way that availability had been crowding out. That feeling is what I'm building toward. Not the absence of care. Not the inability to give. But the ability to give from fullness rather than from fear. To say yes when it's true and no when it's also true, and to survive the discomfort of the boundary without needing the other person's approval to know that I'm enough. I should have said no sooner. I should have said it to 100 people before this project, for 100 different requests. But I couldn't, then. I didn't know what I was doing or why. Now I do. And that's not nothing. The recovery, if I can call it that, happened in layers. The first layer was physical. Getting enough sleep. Eating properly. Doing the basic maintenance that I had stopped doing because I'd been giving every available resource to other people and leaving nothing for myself. That took about 3 weeks, and it was necessary before anything else was possible. The second layer was the harder one, changing the internal story. The story that said my value was in my usefulness. That my place in people's lives was conditional on my willingness to show up. That saying no was an act of abandonment rather than an act of self-respect. That story had been with me so long it felt like a fact rather than a belief. Distinguishing between those two things, between a belief so familiar it feels structural and an actual fact about reality, required a lot of time and a lot of help. What I've been working toward is this, being generous from surplus rather than from fear. The difference isn't always visible from the outside. I still show up, I still help, I still invest in the people I love. But the source is different. It's coming from somewhere full rather than somewhere already depleted. And that difference, inside the experience of giving, is everything. The people who actually care about you don't need you to run empty to prove it. And anyone who only shows up when you do, anyone who withdraws the moment you assert a limit, is showing you something important about what they were actually there for. I have fewer people in my inner circle now than I did 3 years ago. I used to think that meant I was doing something wrong. Now I think it might be the most accurate thing about me. Quality over availability. That's what I'm building toward. Even if it means sitting with the discomfort of the word no, still new in my mouth, still a little foreign, until it starts to feel like what it actually is, the truth. There's something else I want to name, because I think it's important and I didn't see it clearly until recently. The exhaustion I felt during those 12-hour days wasn't just about the workload. I've worked long hours before. I've had demanding projects before. What made this one collapse me wasn't the quantity of work, it was the quality of resentment underneath it. Every hour I worked on previous sections, I was also working at something else, the narrative of my own martyrdom. I was constructing, in real time, a story about how much I was giving and how little it was noticed. And that story, the telling and retelling of it to myself, was consuming more energy than the actual tasks. Resentment is expensive. More expensive than the work it attaches to. And it's a cost you pay privately, silently, with no external accounting for it. The way out of resentment is not to work less or give less. The way out is to be honest about what you're actually willing to give before you give it, so that the giving comes without the accompanying narrative of sacrifice. Simple, in theory. Genuinely difficult in practice when your default setting is yes. But I'm practicing. And the yes I say now, when I say it, is clean. It comes without a bill I'm running in the background. It comes from the part of me that actually wants to give, not from the part that's afraid of what happens if I don't. That difference might not be visible to anyone else. But inside, it feels like the difference between helping and being helped into exhaustion. And I'll take that difference every time,